Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey, Master Hacker, I has your IP address, Knockreiner. I has all the IP addresses.
Corey's what we call a elite hacker? Yes.
Elite. Don't call me Script Kitty.
Despite his joking, on today's episode, we'll discuss one story of how you could turn that IP address into an actual nation-state-backed attack. After that, we'll cover CISA's Notice of Proposed Rulemaking around CIRCIA, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. And then we will end with a postmortem by the US government on Microsoft's big oopsie back in the summer of 2023. Now with that, let's go ahead and hack our way in.
We need to make an acronym for that, like CIRCIA. Hack our way in. Hey, HOA? Hoey? Howie?
Mahalo.
Aloha.
No, we don't. So let's start with the first item, which happened, I guess, about a week and a half ago is when this first got published. But I stumbled across it just a few days ago, where the US Justice Department unsealed indictments against 7 individuals from the People's Republic of China that were allegedly involved in state-sponsored hacking against foreign governments and other businesses over the last 14 years. The indictment and I guess the statement that went along with it from Director Christopher Wray was pretty damning against these folks, basically saying they were responsible for going after geopolitical rivals for espionage, other private businesses for espionage. They claimed they sent 10,000 emails to victims. And actually, they talk a little bit about specifically what happened in this event. So they said they sent 10,000 victims to 10,000 emails to victims where they pretended to be from prominent news outlets or pretended to be journalists. They had links to what were ultimately like legitimate news stories. And I don't know about you, Corey, but when I typically hear about like China's state-sponsored threat actors sending a bunch of emails to victims, my first assumption is, okay, they're trying to steal credentials or they're trying to deliver malware. But in the case of this, they actually weren't doing either with these emails. It was pretty simple. They were just trying to trick victims into going to a web server that these attackers owned, which housed these legitimate news articles that on their own didn't have any malware or anything in them. But what they were doing was collecting information from the clients connecting to these web servers, so they could figure out your IP
by that
address,
you just mean, I assume most of our listeners know, but the average internet user doesn't realize how much information your browser sends as headers. So you started onto the list right away, IP, but I assume browser information could be ways to get location data from the IP. The browser information might start keying you off on device, and I think there's other ways you could start to learn more about there. But what were all the things they were looking for?
Yeah, so like user agent header is another example where when your web browser connects to a website, it tells it basically exactly what operating system you're using, what web browser you're using, and the versions of all of those. So you can get information about what client those targeted victims are using. And then they took this information and used it to specifically target individuals by doing things like compromising their home routers. So like this is where it makes sense that they do this, but like historically when I hear, I guess let me give an example. So Corey, you're pretty big into gaming too as well, right?
Yep.
And I don't know about you, but I always hear folks from like in gaming communities talking about, oh, I'm going to get their IP address and then I'm going to go hack them or whatever. And in my head, I'm like, okay, getting someone's IP address, it's basically like just getting their home address. It doesn't give you a key into the door. It just tells you where they live. So in this case, where they are in cyberspace. And there is those additional steps of then quote unquote hacking them. This is an example where they got their IP address, and then they did go and hack them. So they went and specifically targeted like exposed consumer grade network devices that they had set up as their routers for their gateways. Maybe use this information to like set up watering hole attacks against other areas they may have visited. Like there's actually a lot you can do with just an IP address if you're motivated to go after a specific target.
I think you have to be motivated, knowledgeable, and the victim has to often do something wrong. Not all the time, but often do something wrong. I think the reason, like, I don't know if you're on the subreddit Master Hacker. It's always fun for a few giggles.
I
Master
haven't heard that
Hacker
one.
is like a joke where, it's they always send images of some kitty skitty saying, "Oh, I'll hack you. I have your IP," and it's usually really dumb stuff where you can tell they actually don't know anything. But to your point, I think the reason we make fun of the guys that say, "Oh, I have your IP," is that doesn't like guarantee you've owned them. And usually, if you're on a Comcast like router or a Comcast like ISP, that's going to sometimes change too. But your point is equally valid: is having their IP isn't no information. At the very least, that IP will tell you what ISP they're from, and depending on the services that customer has open, a lot more. And I think we found in the state sponsored attacks, if they know known vulnerabilities in some of these consumer routers that a lot of ISPs use, I mean, at the very least, there might be a known vulnerability. There could be default passwords. There's a lot of tech documentation about how one ISP, if they come into a default setup for your router, their default is to for your password to make it your phone number so you remember it until you change it. But whoever changes it, the phone number is actually a convenient, easy thing to remember. So that right away gives the threat actor maybe your router's default admin password. If they have gathered, in this case they weren't gathering your phone number from the information, but this is a state sponsored actor that might go to data leaks and find your phone number. So, like you say, there's a lot of ways that if you have that IP and the victim has done something stupid like open ports and is presenting vulnerabilities, or B, just learning enough information about your router, which is targeted. It's not valueless information, even though 90% of the time the kids on Discord who say they can hack you from your IP probably don't have the skills. I would suggest the state-sponsored attacker is a little different, like you say.
And let's talk about compromising home routers too, because this is actually a bit more insidious than you may realize under the hood, where we're presuming as a nation state sponsored threat actor, they're also probably trying to go after credentials too. So they're maybe trying to get your credentials to like your Exchange Online email account or your Google account, whatever. But like a lot of these online services and a lot of more mature organizations are actually pretty good at spotting anomalous authentication activity. So, for example, if I commonly log in from one IP address and then you see my account log in from another IP address based out of the nation of China, like that's an immediate red flag. But if they've compromised my home router and they can set up some form of like proxy through that router, then because in often cases in these situations, they're able to basically run arbitrary code or set up a web shell on these devices to do whatever they want. Like now they can source that authentication coming from my home IP address. And so that might let it slip past some of this anomaly detection. Like I can see why they would go after network equipment like that at someone's home.
For
And this
sure.
is a risk of remote work now as well too.
Absolutely.
So in this case, though, the DOJ and their indictments say they went out after prominent employees, government employees. For example, they went after some prominent American businesses. In some cases, they are specific examples. They went after a high-ranking Department of Justice official, a high-ranking White House official, and multiple U.S. senators. And they even went after the spouses of these individuals too. So for example, maybe they went after director Christopher Wray's wife as a potential target. Because again, like if you're high up in the government, you are valuable, and there are other ways than just going after you directly to gain a foothold within your home network.
That kind
Makes
of
sense.
sucks because, like, you're also not your weak. Like, if you're high up in the government, you're probably relatively okay at security practice, so you may not be an easy phishing or social engineering target, let alone a hard target with vulnerabilities. But they know that even government and intelligence workers have spouses and family who may be softer targets. It's the same old kind of supply chain, in this case, human capital supply chain of the small fish become the weaker link to the big fish.
Yep.
Nefarious, man. It
Well,
makes you
so
angry if you're being targeted through your family members.
yeah, absolutely. I guess the good news in this case, so the whole point of this story is the FBI did identify 7 individuals that were directly involved in this campaign, and they did unseal indictments against them, which there's 0% chance China extradites any of these to the US. But it also means now they can no longer travel to any friendly country to the US
Yeah,
anymore.
it keeps them locked in. But at the same time, I feel like these are more political releases, and that, like you say, they I don't think they have much hope of catching these people, even though they know who they are. But it's kind of a hey, Chinese
We know who
government,
you are and
we're
what you did.
watching this, and we're not letting it go, and we're telling the world to. So
Yeah,
it's still a win. I think it's still good to do, but it is kind of a bummer
it
that there's
is.
not
But
much we
this is
can
something
do about
that
it politically.
It is something the FBI has explicitly said they're going to continue doing and increase in what they're trying to do is hold people accountable as much as they can.
You can,
Because even if you
yeah.
can't like go in and arrest them, you can at least limit their travel and limit their ability to do anything else because of their crimes.
Sanction money if any of these people try to store money outside their country that could potentially be locked up in friendly countries, and if they're in friendly countries. So yeah, it's still it's the best way to have some sort of justice when you can actually get to the the threat actors in the countries themselves.
Yep, exactly. So moving on, Uh, just about a week ago, CISA, the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure, and Security Agency, unveiled their notice of proposed rulemaking in response to the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, or CIRCIA, which was enacted in 2022. This act covered a few things, and I guess first off, pausing for a round of applause for our Congress. It was 2 years ago, but our Congress actually passing legislation. That's somewhat impressive.
Wow.
The act, among other things, instructed CISA to develop regulatory requirements for critical infrastructure sectors around reporting covered security incidents and ransomware payments directly to CISA. The goal is to improve coordination and response efforts across an industry. Basically, if we know one or entity within a critical infrastructure sector is being targeted, CISA wants to know about that so they can proactively identify and defend that same attack against other entities.
By the way, this is just an aside, but for those that watch our podcast on YouTube, I'm actually showing the proposed rule, and I won't show it for long because, as you can see, it's very much a law bill type document that's very dense, full of table of
133
context.
pages.
Yeah, this is not light reading, so you can definitely give your thanks to Mister Mark for summarizing this for you. You wouldn't want to go through it yourself.
Yeah, so let's go through that summary. Like, first off, the main meat and bones of it covered entities. So basically, organizations that are considered critical infrastructure would now have 72 hours to report a covered cybersecurity incident, which we'll talk about in a second, to CISA, and 24 hours to report a ransomware payment to CISA. When it
It's
comes to
quick.
those,
I
yeah,
guess it makes sense for critical infrastructure, but that's pretty quick.
it is pretty quick. It's going to apply to around 316,000 entities across our 16 defined critical infrastructure sectors. But it specifically does not apply to small businesses as defined by the Small Business Administration unless a separate sector specific based criteria is met. And just to give a quick example of what small business would look like, the Small Business Administration actually has this table. It's like 18 pages long of different definitions of sectors and like a threshold as long as you're under this threshold, you qualify as a small business. For example, MSPs, MSSPs, and value-added resellers for IT, at up to 150 employees, you're considered a small business officially by the SBA.
By the way, even if you were a MSP or MSSP above that, and thus more than a small business, a mid-sized business, or even mid-market enterprise, that doesn't necessarily mean you will fall under this criteria unless you specifically serve something that we'll talk about when we go into more depth on the criteria, right?
Yep, exactly. But so that document from the Small Business Administration covers everything from telecommunications providers to nuclear power plant operators to water supply, like any type of different sector. And while small businesses are exempt from this mandatory reporting, there are a few specific cases where they still have to follow along with it. So, for example, if you're a small business that owns and operates a chemical facility, you'd still fall under this. Other areas are providing wire or radio services, defense contractors, energy services, state, local, tribal governments, education, IT support specifically for elections is one. Healthcare, transportation, water supply. There's a whole list of like specific areas where even if you're a tiny little company, you still need to comply with this.
Rando question, but I wonder if it might be different than wire or radio services because, but do television broadcasters apply to that? I would think in some way because we do emergency services. As part of the, I think FCC, they're required to be one of the ways we broadcast emergency services, but it doesn't seem to outline television broadcasters, but it does radio, which, anyways, got me thinking. I don't know. I don't know if they qualify for this or not.
My assumption would be no. I don't know if like telecommunications like that is considered a critical infrastructure. The infrastructure that transmits the broadcast or whatever it might be.
Maybe.
But like I don't know,
Or
NBC
radio. I
News
think
or whatever.
radio
Yeah.
is literally a public utility that we use for emergency communication from a government perspective, at least here in the US. So just
It's interesting.
curiosity.
I'm gonna defer to my lawyers on that interpretation. Um, so when it comes to those covered events, they actually give a whole bunch of different specific examples. It's a non-exhaustive list, they said, but as a few examples that are explicitly covered, things like denial of service attacks, ransomware, risks that could physically expose hazardous materials to the public, risks to emergency services, extended network downtime due to a incident. There's a pretty big list of things that they make sense that you would want to have reported to CISA. There are 3 penciled out exceptions to this as well too. So for example, the first one is if a substantially similar report has already been submitted by another agency, then you are exempt from having to submit one yourself. This one's interesting. A cyber incident that impacts certain entities related to domain name systems or DNS. That one's interesting. I'm wondering why they're specifically exempting DNS registrars from reporting these types of
Yeah,
events.
on one hand, that seems to be the type of thing the government would really, really want to know quickly, right? I mean,
Yeah,
DNS is really one of the core functions of the internet. If there were any issue with a registrar, it could be literal man in the middle possibilities. So why they're exempting it makes me wonder if they already have some sort of in, or if it because in that sort of investigation they would want to keep it quiet until they were ready to tell the world about it. It is interesting to think about based on what we've kind of learned a little bit about
that's
government
my
investigation processes.
it's my tinfoil hat theory is that maybe they don't need it to be reported because the NSA is already fully embedded within every US based DNS registrar. That's my
Yeah.
assumption. My
Could be.
educated guess, I would say.
Okay.
The third and final exemption are federal agencies that are already covered under another reporting requirement mechanism from FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. Now, the next bit is interesting, and I've actually had discussions personally with some folks at CISA that are very uneasy about this next bit, and it's enforcement. So historically, CISA has been like the friend you call in to help when there's a security incident. They've had a strong policy of they will not report you to any regulating body because they want to encourage businesses if they've or covered entities that if they've suffered or think they've suffered a security incident to immediately notify CISA without like any questions asked and any concern that you will end up getting like punched in the face because of it. And so they've built themselves as this government agency that comes in to help and even proactively goes in to help entities because they want to build that trust relationship. Part of CIRCIA, though, actually establishes CISA as a regulatory authority in the space, though. So, for example, it gives CISA the power to submit a request for information that will require a response within 72 hours. If they don't like that response, it gives them the ability to issue a subpoena, so a court backed subpoena, to gain information from a covered entity. And if they still fail to comply with that, it actually gives CISA the ability to refer that entity to the attorney general for additional enforcement, including fines and being held in contempt. It also gives them the ability to add penalties or entire suspension and disbarment from that entity doing business with the federal government entirely as well. And so I'm curious on your opinion on this, and I'll give my opinion first, where like CISA in this case, they have to have some sort of teeth from this. Otherwise, everyone will ignore it. Like if it's, well, maybe not everyone, but organizations may not be as inclined to follow it if there's no harm from not following it. So I understand why there has to be some teeth to it. I don't think CISA should be the ones with those teeth. I think it has to be some other like regulating agency. So for example, we already have the Department of Energy that's responsible for regulating energy providers in the US. And so it should have been the Department of Energy is responsible for regulating this act within their covered entities. The Food and Drug Administration should have been for like, agriculture and whatever. Like there's other entities that are already regulating bodies.
For radio services and emergency
Exactly.
services. I hear where you're coming from, but to be the devil's advocate, is the Department of Energy cybersecurity experts? Do they really like? I think part of the reason other agencies have to uh, kind of step in with these rules is because the Department of Transportation and some of these departments are more about transportation than they are all the IT technologies associated with providing them in the modern day. So I'm just not sure if they're the right people to know how to handle an emergency. I get it from a regulatory; they're the regulatory body for that industry in our country, but I don't mind a overarching cybersecurity agency stepping in. I didn't know if you're going to go to the direction of more the actual law authority, like the FBI, like for actual breaches and compromises and ransomware and attacks. The FBI is the law body that, at least in the United States federal government, would be the one that would want to know about the cyber incident and would maybe pop in to take care of it. They work already closely with CISA, I believe. And I could see them being the agency that has more authority to kind of require this because they work on going after the actual criminals. And one question I had, by the way, when we're going through the exemption is I also know from some of their historical cases that they sometimes, when they get into an investigation, they want to delay some of the public reports at least, of the breach or whatever to finish their investigation. So I wonder how that works with CISA. When you're reporting it to the CISA, are you still keeping it quiet from the world while the other government agencies investigate with that breach victim? But yeah, I
So
don't know.
there's
I guess I don't have strong feelings with CISA kind of taking ownership of this for cyber. I thought you might be going more towards the FBI than the Department of Energy. And I just don't think that the traditional departments have traditionally known how to handle cyber. Sorry, I'm using
there's three
cyber.
things in there
Yeah, okay.
that I think all those are important, and let's talk about them. And I want to make sure we get to all three. So I'm going to start in the middle with the FBI as a potential entity involved in this. And I think the FBI, like from even years in my experience,
That's the
they're
one
also
that
trying to
companies are
come in as
scared of. Yeah.
well, correct, but
In the
they're trying to
past.
come in. Yes.
Go ahead.
They're trying to come in as the we're not going to victimize the victim approach.
Yes.
And so if you contact the FBI, they're similar. They want you to, they not even just critical infrastructure, they want any cybersecurity event victim to notify the FBI if they've been victimized by cybercrime. And the
Yeah.
FBI comes in and promises saying, we're not going to try and come in here and like slap you with, regulatory fines or victimize you or throw you in jail for this. Like we're here to help find and make you whole as a victim. And so I think similarly, when it comes to the teeth for CIRCIA, the FBI probably doesn't want those teeth either, because that puts in jeopardy that potential relationship.
Yeah, they don't want to be the bad guy. That makes sense. They're already, and as I alluded to, they used to have businesses were scared of reporting to them, even though the stance that you said they have is the right one they have. So they're really trying to change that historical view of them to we're here to help. So I get why they wouldn't want to come off as someone with teeth,
And
regulatory.
your first point, so the devil's advocate point, and I think there's actually two pieces in this. So first out, separating out the who handles the reporting from who enforces CIRCIA. So I do think CISA needs to be the one that handles the reporting. Like we need a central government authority that kind of coordinates incident response across critical infrastructure, and so that has to be CISA. But from enforcing like the regulation side, that should be
Regulation. Yeah.
outside of CISA. So someone not complying with CIRCIA in this case, not doing the reporting, it should be their other regulating body coming in and saying, hey, we noticed that you didn't report that incident. Now we're going to fine you or whatever.
This is one of
And
our
that's where I think some of these
regulations to
should
be
come
in
in.
this industry, this critical infrastructure industry.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But side point though, I thought of this too, as you're mentioning, there's not cyber expertise in the Department of Transportation or Department of Energy. I
That just so
would,
you know, me and Mark are or at
correct.
least I was speculating there. I just from historical grade reports and stuff like that, it's a new focus for them, and our government departments sometimes seem to be a little behind on technology. So purely speculation.
And so this is but it's an important, I think, like kind of tangent from this, like not related to CIRCIA itself, but these government agencies need to hire security experts if they aren't already. Like, yes, Department of Transportation, you're responsible for like road safety and stuff like that, but there is a lot of technology that goes into
Yeah.
supporting that, and we need to
Train
have
schedule
security experts on
switches
that.
are
Yeah.
automated on trains, traffic lights, city, yeah, tons of technology, and even the most uh, basic thing that you think is not related to technology.
Yeah. Like the Department of Agriculture isn't just about farming anymore. Like we need to protect the food supply chain. And to support that, I think every single like security needs to be embedded in all of these different agencies if it isn't already. And I mean, you and I are speculating. I'm hoping that they have already started that process. I have to admit I'm a bit ignorant on what may have or may not have been done. But I while we do need a central kind of like coordinating authority like CISA, we need that expertise across the entirety of the federal government from who the organizations that are working with these different sectors every single day.
Your hopes are my hopes, but whenever we talk about energy, it seems like the energy industry is just so backwards as far as connected cybersecurity. It's hard for me to, should the regulatory body have hired somebody 10 years ago or more? Yes. But it just seems the things they're talking about, and maybe that's less the regulating body and these small energy companies that are just not doing it. But
Yep.
I guess I'm not as gung ho about them knowing enough about cybersecurity without a agency that deals directly with it.
And then the final thing you brought up was other exceptions. For example, like under active investigations, there are other exceptions in here or other things that help with that. For example, all of these reports are exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests.
Uh,
And so, like,
gotcha.
random people can't go in and get these through a FOIA request. And there are some penciled out things for specifically uh, incidents under active investigation. But that said, CISA is supposed to be that coordinating body across the federal
Yeah,
government. And so, if
they
there
should
is
know
something
about
under
it
active,
even if they're
yeah,
not
exactly.
making it public. Yeah.
because they're the ones that'll help bring in the FBI to do that investigation,
Yep.
for example. And I'm assuming in this case, there's already like back channel communications from the FBI to CISA when the FBI is like goes in to investigate something at, say, Microsoft. Tangent to the next story.
Yeah.
They probably notify CISA in some capacity that there's a incident going on with this important organization. I don't know.
Hazard to guess you're right.
But either way, so this 140 whatever page notice of proposed rulemaking is available for comment for the next 60 days. The timeline from CISA is they expect the final rules no later than October of 2025, so 18 months from now.
Whew, I
Pretty
give you
tight
time to read.
timeline.
And the good
Yeah.
news is if you're not in one of these critical infrastructure groups or you don't serve them, you don't have to worry about giving. I mean, it'd be kind of silly to give feedback on something that doesn't affect you.
Yep.
But on the flip
But
side, if you are,
I'd expect that even though you might fall under a small little carve out, you should probably plan for reporting to CISA anytime you've had a meaningful security incident on a quick timeline. And like all this is good. Like at the end of the day, the point of this is to allow the federal government to help defend our critical infrastructure. And in order to do that, they need to know about the incidents that are going on.
even the regulation, Mark, I feel like I get why businesses are scared of regulation, but and to some, regulation is just a bad word right away. But to me, it should not. It's we need to find some sort of middle ground of trust. I don't really think, maybe I'm not deep state enough a mentality person, but I don't really think the government is out to try to regulate everything and control everything and make life hard for businesses. I think it only comes to it when there's real problems that are happening at a scale where they feel like they have to step in. So
I
my interpretation is CISA isn't trying to they're doing this not because they want to overregulate any sort of industry. It's literally because they want to help these industries that have just in the past 3 years suffered from decent compromises that it's pretty serious when it's critical infrastructure.
Yeah, let's draw a parallel. Like for the food industry in the US, we have the most highly regulated food safety uh, industry or food delivery system out of any country in the world. And it's not perfect. Like stuff slips through all the time because it's at the scale of an entire country. It's difficult to have eyes on literally everything. But it's still like I, for one, that's something I'm happy about. Like I'm glad that I can go to the grocery store and have reasonable suspicion or reasonable
Yeah,
certainty that the food I'm going to
people
get
can't
isn't going
sell
to poison me.
something that will injure me. Yeah.
Exactly. That said, unless it's romaine lettuce from California that consistently has E. coli in it. But other than that, I have reasonable certainty I'm not going to die from the food I get at the grocery store. And that's a good thing. And I think there are places for regulations, and cybersecurity clearly has to be one of them because voluntary asks are just not happening on a quick enough timeline. So moving on to the last story, also involving our friends at the federal government. Last month, the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Safety Review Board released a 34-page postmortem of Microsoft's Exchange Online intrusion that happened last year in the summer of 2023. And it was honestly pretty sassy and pretty damning. So if you don't remember this story,
No, not the
uh,
Garner analyst sassy, right? Not the as a secure access service edge sassy, more the sassy.
this was, yeah, maybe sassy isn't the right word, but it was
I
like
get what you mean.
they pulled no punches in this report and calling out mistakes that they saw along the way. If you're not familiar with the incident or you forgot about it, this is that one where China-backed hackers compromised several email accounts of high-ranking government officials around the world, including the Secretary of Commerce and the U.S. Ambassador to China, which they did by obtaining a Microsoft signing key, an MSA key, from the consumer side of Microsoft's ecosystem and leveraged it to access the enterprise side by basically generating their own authentication tokens to get into these mailboxes. The very end of the report, they pointed to, quote, the cascade of Microsoft's avoidable errors that allowed this intrusion to succeed. Yeah. And there's a few quotes throughout this that I'm going to read as we get to them. Because, first off, some of them are just riddled with huge amounts of detail. It's really interesting. And some of them are just them smashing Microsoft in the face with some of the errors they saw along the way. So it claims, first off, early on, when it's talking about Microsoft's response and analysis to this, that Microsoft misled the public when it said that the root cause of this intrusion, when it said it knew the root cause of this intrusion. So they said that even today, Microsoft doesn't know. So if you remember, Microsoft, they released a blog post a few months after this, claiming that the most likely way that this key was compromised was through a crash report in a lower level environment that had been, or in the environment that had been exported out of the environment, and that the key likely resided somewhere in memory of that crash report, which is how they were able to get it. But so in this this report from the Cyber Safety Review Board, they said, quote, despite Microsoft's pursuit of the 46 key theft hypotheses, the board assesses that Microsoft does not know how Storm 0558, the threat actors, obtained the 2016 MSA key. So it points that Microsoft alleged it was the crash dump. They initially released a blog post, which saying that that was the cause. They actually updated it several days later, saying, actually, that's just a theory. And now the board is saying there's no evidence to even support that theory. There's no evidence of any crash reports during that time. And this is literally just Microsoft guessing at a hypothesis without any supporting evidence, and that they were misleading the public. So I want to pause there for a second, Corey, and get your thoughts on that one. Because I feel like it's important to share hypotheses during incident response like this, to share like how you think it might have occurred. And my interpretation from this is the Cyber Safety Review Board is saying Microsoft, in sharing it, was giving it too much credit as like the likely scenario versus just here's a hypothesis. But what are your
I guess
thoughts,
I
Corey?
could see points on both, but it would depend on their tone. I kind of lean towards what you said at first. I remember when we were covering this issue, we felt, or at least I felt, that kudos that Microsoft was trying to be transparent. This was a big deal. And you have to admit, as an organization, when you have something as critical as this big key stolen, and it's in a very complex situation that you haven't perfectly found out, by being transparent, you're like making a choice to say we're not 100% sure yet, which kind of sucks, because I personally think the reality is every company would be in that situation when you're investigating. But as a customer, it's like, oh no, do they know what they're doing? And they did. I believe Microsoft knows what they're doing, and they were investigating to the best of their ability. And I appreciate companies that share enough transparent detail to help us figure out things that we might need to look for in our case, even if they're developing things. But at the same time, I guess it depends on, how do you judge them if that preliminary information wasn't right? And did they do updates? Are they keeping you updated? Did they try to hide if when more was known? I don't know. I don't think so. But I also haven't investigated as much as this organization to really make a strong opinion. So maybe this organization is right in some ways too. Depending on Microsoft's wording, maybe they claimed it too strongly. But I personally remember thinking that Microsoft was trying their best to be relatively transparent to protect its customers and teach the industry some of the failings. And a
Yeah,
lot
so.
happened during 2023 as we learned this was happening.
And so let's talk about the key for a second here, where this key started in 2016 is when Microsoft first deployed it. You got an infographic they include in the report that's pretty interesting. And historically, Microsoft actually rotated their cryptographic keys somewhat regularly. On the enterprise side, they have a automated system for doing it. But apparently on the consumer side, it was manual, and they even stopped it when it broke something. And so there's a whole paragraph here I want to read real quick from the report that's pretty interesting and also pretty damning. So it says Microsoft designed its consumer MSA identity infrastructure more than 20 years ago Later, it introduced an enterprise Entra infrastructure, previously known as Azure Active Directory. Initially, the consumer MSA system had no process for automated signing key rotation or deactivation and utilized a manual process instead. Over time, Microsoft automated the key rotation process in the enterprise system with the intent for the consumer MSA system to follow and use the same technology, but it had not done so for the consumer system before this intrusion. Microsoft continued to rotate the consumer MSA keys infrequently and manually until it stopped the rotation entirely in 2021, following a major cloud outage linked to the manual rotation process. While Microsoft has paused the manual key rotation, it neither had nor created an automated alerting system to notify the appropriate Microsoft teams about the age of active signing keys in consumer MSA services. So they're basically saying, they got it all working for the enterprise side. The consumer side, they were waiting for kind of a fast follow. They never got around to it. Something caught on fire, so they just stopped the manual process entirely, and they just let it get old, which is why this key from 2016 was still valid in 2023.
Yeah, and this isn't a justification, by the way, but I'm going to take the contrarian, vendor view. When you were designing something like a product critical digital certificate 20 years ago, there were security processes and regulations that didn't exist, right? I mean, even PKI was, I guess PKI was probably somewhat licked 20 years ago. But the point is, I feel like a lot of businesses create good processes for their time, and then they keep on moving on to new products, and all the new products get even better cybersecurity processes, because as times change and best practices improve, your new stuff gets that new stuff. What I'm saying is it's not unthinkable for a almost, how long is Microsoft? Microsoft is past 50 years, right? For a long time organization to have a little bit of legacy that may not have been the worst decisions 20 years ago, but now are need updates. But it's hard to kind of do that legacy update while you're pushing the newest processes with the newer stuff. That's not to say they shouldn't have updated this consumer key once they had the process. I have a feeling what happened here is probably very similar to any organization that develops code over time, that you just have these older processes that sometimes are actually a lot of work, and the result would be a big disruption to customers for you to maybe update them to new processes. So you have to really weigh when you do things.
Devil's advocate, I understand that. My retort is, this isn't some small organization and some random feature. This is the email that millions of people use, owned by Microsoft.
Yeah.
And when it comes to rotating cryptographic secrets that allow someone to that handle the authentication into that system, maybe it needs a little bit of proactive effort in order to.
I agree, but we learned recently that holding on to digital certificates that you use for critical things can actually have lifetimes of 10 to 20 years, according to some of even the security publications. So,
Yep,
I
hear you.
how often should you really be rotating them? Every year? I would say yes. It makes sense the same way it does with passwords and other things, especially if you're worried about compromise. But there's a lot of people that have long-lived certificates.
And well, in this case, it's not even a certificate. It's the key used to
Yeah,
generate a authenticated session cookie, basically. And that is something where the industry a long time ago agreed that that needs to
that's
rotate
true.
relatively frequently in case
Quickly.
this
Yeah,
exact situation happens where it gets compromised.
it gets out. Yeah, and then it's out forever for everyone until you rotate it.
So either way, that's one item. So another thing they talked about was how this was discovered. So they threw some shade at Microsoft for the fact that one of their customers, one of these federal government agencies, are the ones that actually discovered the incident. And they gave some more detail that I wasn't aware of, at least before I read this report. So they said it was initially discovered by a state security operations center analyst that detected the event thanks to an alert that was generated with some enhanced logging that they had purchased through a G5 license. And they noted that few other victim organizations had purchased that same license. And if you remember, in response to this incident, Microsoft actually came out and expanded the availability of free logging that was otherwise
Yep.
locked behind this license. So hats off to them. They did respond to it then. But so they talked about the alert. It was designed to look for a specific event, the mail items accessed event, where they started by creating a baseline for their organization to understand the applications that were accessing user mailboxes. And this alert was designed to look for anomalies, basically new applications touching mailboxes. And it would give them specific application details, context about that particular mailbox involved, and it basically gave that state organization the ability to look for potential issues quickly. And so the state organization spotted this pretty quickly. It was, if you remember from the incident, it was a application that was unusual, like a brand new application using a key to access a mailbox. And because it was a unusual application, that's how they caught it. But they were only able to see this because of those logs that they had purchased, like the additional logging capabilities. And I'll go through like their kind of fiery response later. But they basically said that this is kind of bogus, that Microsoft, first off, locked this behind additional costs, and that they themselves did not have any telemetry or alerting capabilities, and they had to be notified by a customer that these keys were being used erroneously. They gave some examples of separate Storm 558 activities. So I guess there was another intrusion by these same threat actors in 2021 that Microsoft believes, and there's a quote in here, which is pretty funny. So Microsoft believes, quote, although it produced no specific evidence to such effect, that this 2021 event was likely related to the 2023 attack. And this incident is actually important to talk about, I think. So it involved a compromised set of credentials from an engineer at Microsoft that actually came from an acquisition. So in 2020, Microsoft acquired Affirm Networks, which was a 5G technology provider. And prior to that acquisition, an engineer at Affirmed had their device compromised. And the US government thinks that the likely scenario is they were specifically targeted because they work with 5G technology. And from an espionage perspective, China would want access to that. So this engineer was compromised. The company they worked for was acquired by Microsoft. After the acquisition, Microsoft gave them corporate Microsoft credentials to get into Microsoft's corporate environment. And then the existing compromise on that machine was able to steal the credentials, the authentication token, and access the environment as that employee. And this is a example of like one of the risks of M&A activity.
M&A, mergers and acquisitions, yeah.
But
you inherit any potential malware, part of the due diligence better be checking for breaches of that organization. Depending on security cultures, you might want to forensically research that network before you start to integrate. Yeah.
And to Microsoft's defense, they do say they've got a robust process for doing exactly that, going in and evaluating the organization, doing security assessments, sending in their own security auditing team to look for and remediate those risks, both pre and post acquisition. But in this case, like I can understand how it can be tough for them to analyze every single user laptop in a company pre acquisition, and so I can understand how they could have missed an infection on one of these devices. I'd argue that maybe they should have given them a Microsoft-owned device as part of the acquisition to just kind of start fresh. But speaking from experience, sometimes that isn't always diplomatically possible. So the end of the report, though, quickly get into it, was the most fiery part of it, the last paragraph of it. And I'm going to read it verbatim. So it says, the board concludes Microsoft's security culture was inadequate. If Microsoft had not paused manual rotation of keys, if it had completed the migration of its MSA environment to rotate keys automatically, if it had put in place technical or other controls to generate alerts for aging keys, the 2016 MSA key would not have been valid in 2023. Further, if Microsoft had not made the error that allowed consumer keys to authenticate to enterprise consumer data, or alternatively, if it had detected and addressed this flaw, the scope of the intrusion would have been far narrower and would not have impacted the State Department, Commerce Department, or any other enterprise customers. If Microsoft had deployed alerting or prevention to detect forged tokens that do not conform to Microsoft's own token generation algorithms, this incident likely could have also been stopped and detected by Microsoft all on its own. Even after this, if Microsoft had other security controls in place for its digital identity systems, as the board finds other CSPs had in place at this time, this intrusion vector could have been blocked or detected. Finally, once the State Department alerted Microsoft to an intrusion, Microsoft did not have the logs or other forensic data to determine how or when Storm 0558 had stolen this key. Or basically, they listed out the, what do they call it, cascading series of errors that resulted in this. Like, there were several, and I know like hindsight's 2020, but there were several opportunities along the way here to prevent or at least mitigate this incident. And any one of these little things along the ways could have at least limited the scope. And at the same time, I understand from Microsoft's perspective how it could have ended up in this situation. But man, it's pretty rough seeing this come from the Department of Homeland Security laying it all out.
It is M365. I mean, literally tens of millions, I'm sure, use that service. So,
yep, exactly.
Exchange.
Either way,
but hey, hopefully that list is now enacted.
And the good news is, again, so this is like the retrospective of what led up to and during the incident. Again, Microsoft's response to it, though, has been great. Like, they expanded the audit logging availability that was previously locked behind the license. They directly responded to that. They have, in theory, improved their process as well for detecting these incidents too. So, like, I'm confident we won't have a repeat of this one. But it seems like there at least were some things that Microsoft could have done to mitigate this sometime in the last 7 years that did not occur. But I guess if you are a Microsoft user, you're hopefully safe now. In theory.
Yeah.
At least until
they
the
had
next
the key that they could have read
away.
Everyone's email, but don't worry, they only focused on, what was it, like 50 or 60 companies. You're fine.
It was pretty narrowly scoped.
If that's true.
Correct.
We hope, or Microsoft and the government claim.
Yes, as they do. But I mean, in this specific one, if you weren't a high-ranking person, in theory, you're safe. But if anyone that works for the federal government listens to this podcast, then yikes. Good luck. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
I just love how you gag every time you say Instagram, but somehow it's still better than X.
I've totally given up on the site formerly known as Twitter.